Welcome to the Gray Path Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Tony B. Today, we're going to do another deep dive into a character. I really enjoy doing these types of episodes. We're going to kind of switch gears. The last few ones have been on Star Wars characters. This one is going to be a character from the world of Dragonlance. That is a very, very large universe. Not as large as Star Wars, but probably pretty close. I got into Dragonlance. I believe it was in my late teens when I first got into it, and it was just an amazing universe, amazing set of books. The original trilogy, if you will, are these three books right here, which are Dragons of Autumn Twilight, Dragons of Spring Dawning, and Dragons of Winter Night. Now, for years, and I haven't done this in a long time, and I definitely plan to change that soon. For years, I would read each one of these based upon whatever season was going on. So in autumn, I would read Autumn Twilight. In spring, I would read Spring Dawning. In winter, I would read Winter Night. And they work really well if you read them with the particular season, especially here in Pennsylvania, because we actually have all of the seasons. Not to mention they're just incredibly well written books, and then they're followed up by what is, I think, arguably even a better trilogy, which is they call it the War of the Twins. So the books are Time, War, and Test. Fantastic series. Today's deep dive is into a main character from a group that is called the Heroes of the Lance. I think they were called the Companions for a while as well, and that is Caramon Majere. Now, Caramon Majere, he is a human. He is a twin brother to probably what is arguably the most famous character in Dragonlance, which is Raceland Majere. We're not going to focus this episode on Raceland. We're going to focus on Caramon, his twin brother. So Caramon's twin brother is Raceland, and his half-sister is Kitara. Now, all of these characters play very important roles in the story, but we are going to focus today's episode specifically on Caramon. And we're going to use Caramon as a lens, if you will, into describing the importance of purpose. And what I mean by that is how important it is to have a purpose. Not just professionally, not just socially, but just in general, to have a purpose, and what can happen when you lose your purpose. So Caramon, like we said, he is a twin, and he has a half sister. Now, Caramon is very much a contrast to his twin, Raceland. Caramon is a very large person. He stands quite tall. I believe he's in the upper parts of 6 foot. And he is a strapping young man, big bulging muscles, incredibly strong, very powerful. He was always referred to as a fighter. So if you're a fan of Dungeons and Dragons, he's very much a fighter class. So on the other side of the spectrum was Caramon's twin brother, Raceland, and Raceland was small and petite and frail. And while Raceland lacked the physical attributes, he more than made up for it in the mental attributes. Caramon was a very kind-hearted man. He was jovial. He was always quick with a joke. He was loved by the ladies, but he wasn't exactly the smartest person in the room. Where Raceland, on the other hand, was kind of socially awkward, rude, not strong, weak constitution, but he was the smartest man in any room he walked into. As we said, Caramon was a fighter, Raceland was a mage, a magic user. So again, just lots of contrast between the two, different sides of the same coin, if you will. Now, Caramon was always as nice as a guy as he was very protective of people, specifically of his brother. And we'll get into, as we get into his background, we'll get into how that protectorate mentality became so integral and so fixed into who Caramon was as an individual. So in the early years, Caramon Caramon in his younger years with Raceland, he kind of focused on helping his his family out. His sister Kitara, who was a little bit older, she was a mercenary, and she would come into town from time to time and train him. And he was always interested in the martial aspects of combat. So he wasn't really interested in spell casting or sneaking around. He always wanted to be in the thick of it. He wanted to use that natural strength and constitution that he had to his benefit. Now, one of the pivotal moments in Caramon's life happened when his brother Raistlin was selected to take what is called the test. And the test is essentially whether or not you can become a mage when you get what they call your robes. So in the world of Dragonlance, and I always loved this about it, the magic caste, if you will, the magic society was all kind of based upon what type of robe you took. So if you took the white robe, that was typically like your lawful good, your typical good. You know, you followed a good deity, you did good things, you were on the side of good. If you took the red robes, it was more neutral ground. I guess you could say in a lot of ways it was the gray path, if you will, was the red robes. And then there was the black robes. And if you followed the black robes, you typically were a follower of the Dragon Queen, who was evil, or some of the other evil deities that existed in the world. So in order to get to that point where you actually get your robes, you have to pass your test. And the test is like this mythical thing for anyone who wants to become a mage, because it's a terrifying ordeal. You don't really know. No one really knows what goes on in the test until you get into it. So a really pivotal moment in Caramon's life comes during Raceland's test, because in a lot of ways, Caramon kind of always played second fiddle to his brother, even though Caramon was the well, I don't know if you want to call it, he was jovial. He was, I guess, charming. He was the good looking one, the strong one, the popular one. He still always played second fiddle to his brother. Now, his brother wasn't outright mean before the test. I mean, he definitely had his snide moments, but I wouldn't say that he was an outright mean person. He definitely bossed Caramon around and used his greater intellect to kind of manipulate Caramon, but he wasn't necessarily outright mean at that point. So during the test, Raistlin confronts this dark elf, and he's battling it out, casting spells and stuff against this dark elf, and he's losing. He's not doing well. And the thing about the test is you can very well die in it. I mean, that's how important it is. So while he's in the middle of this test, something occurs, and Raistlin is able to kill the dark elf. However, what Raistlin didn't know was that was not the end of his test. The end of his test came when he was battered, bleeding, and dying, and he was laying there, and these enemies were coming, and he wasn't going to be able to survive. Even though he had defeated the dark elf, he knew he was still going to die. And his brother Caramon comes out of nowhere and kind of does what he always does, comes to save the day, and kind of pushes past Raistlin. And what was different about this was when Caramon comes to save the day, what he typically would do is draw his sword, and he'd wade into battle, and he'd start hacking and slashing, and that would be it. But that's not what he did. This time he reaches into his pocket and he grabs, I think it was a ruby rod or an amber rod, and a bit of fur. And of course, Raistlin immediately knows what this means. Those are spell components. So in the world of Dragonlance, it's very similar to D&D, where, especially in the older editions, all spells, or most spells, had material components. And in order to cast a spell, you had to have the necessary material component. And so Raislin's laying on the ground, he's bleeding out, he's dying, and his brother's here to save him. But he notices his brother pulls out spell components, and his brother starts casting spells and saving the day. And Raistlin becomes so incensed, so enraged at this, that with his dying breath, his last action before dying is to cast the strongest spell he has and literally obliterates Caramon, just kills him outright. Now, what Raistlin didn't know was that Caramon was never there in the test with him. Raistlin wasn't dying. The head of the Mages clan had purposefully orchestrated this illusion in an attempt to teach Raceland humility. It did not work. It definitely had the adverse effect. But why this was a pivotal moment for Caramon is because Caramon was standing there and he watched his brother kill him out of jealousy. And it was at that point, as you will if you're a fan of Avatar, everything changed when Raceland kills the illusionary version of Caramon. Because at that point, Caramon becomes scared of his brother, but they're twins and he's always been the protector. So to tie this into what we're talking about, this whole episode is on purpose. Caramon's entire purpose in life at this point had kind of been being that big brother to Raceland. And he just watched his little brother kill him out of jealousy and rage and spite. So Raceland passes his test. He gets his robes. And at that point, they kind of go into like a mercenary life for a while. And this is all before the original trilogy. So before these 3 books, this is when all this is taking place. And there's books written about these moments in Caramon's life. And they have their adventures in their mercenary years. Sorry, I had a brain fart there. They had their adventures during their mercenary life, but all of their friends. So Caramon, Raceland, they had all made friends with the people who they knew as the companions, who would eventually go on to be like the heroes of the War of the Lance. And they are Tanis Half-Elven, who was a half-elf. There's Flint, who is a dwarven blacksmith. There's Tasselhoff Burfoot. People tend to fall into 2 camps with Tasselhoff. They either love him or they hate him. He is what's called a Kender. They're a very potentially annoying race. Tasselhoff's good at heart, though. There's Caramon, there's Raceland, and then there's Sturm Brightblade. And Sturm, he's a fun character. He's a human, potentially noble, a knight. And when they all got together and had their little adventures when they were younger, they all went their own ways. Before Caramon and Raceland went to the tower to take, for Raceland to take his test, they'd all split, but they had made a promise that they would meet at a predetermined time a few years down the line. No matter what was going on, they would all return to this inn in their town of Solus, and they would meet back up. So these 3 books, they all start literally with that meeting. And what's interesting is, so if you're starting the series from when it was first written, which is this book right here, the tension that exists between the twins now is palpable in those first few pages, because they all meet up. And when Raceland got out of his test, he wasn't exactly an all-star sportsman or athlete before he went into the test, but the test wrecked him both mentally and physically. It left him with this tremendously terrible cough that he could only soothe temporarily by brewing a special tea. It left his health just shattered. He was already kind of frail to begin with, but after the test, he was sickly and frail. His skin had a golden tint to it now, which no one really understood why. And because killing Caramon occurred during that illusion, and he didn't learn humility, he was instead, I guess you could say, partially gifted, partially cursed with these eyes that made his pupils into the shape of hourglasses. And it forced him to, everything he looked at, he saw the effects of time on it. So if he would look at a beautiful person, instead of seeing that beautiful person, he would see them aging and withering and dying. And it was meant to humble him. We'll do an episode on Raceland sometime and we'll find out if it worked. But anyway, the last time everybody had seen Raceland and Caramon, they were happy-go-lucky, they were, the twins. And they meet up X number of years later, and Raceland's sitting in a corner, and he's gold-skinned with hourglass eyes, and he's fucking mean. Like, he was always kind of like snippy before, but he's straight up mean, because at this point in time, due to his wrecked health, and while he has a lot of magical potential, at this point, he's still not very strong. In D&D terms, he'd be a first level character. So he is forced to count on his brother. He is forced to count on Caramon to protect him, to help him get on and off horses, to help bathe him when he's too weak to bathe, to help him find the ingredients he needs for his uh, special tea. And this becomes Caramon's purpose. Love it or hate it for him, this becomes his purpose in life. His purpose, his goal, his drive, his soul moving forward force is in caring for his brother. And Caramon, while still being scared of his brother, he loves his brother. He loves his twin. Unfortunately, that love was not reciprocated, at least not verbally. Instead, he would get verbal abuse from Raceland. He would just get lashed at, called stupid, called simple, threatened. And it was a bad time. So this went on. I mean, this dynamic between the two carried on as war broke out in the world of Krynn, which is the world of Dragonlance. You know, the whole world kind of falls into chaos, and that's what these 3 books are about, which is really fun. I don't want to ruin the story for anybody, but all hell breaks loose, and the companions, the heroes of the Lance, kind of step up. They step up and they decide that they're going to do something about it. And Caramon is a hero throughout the whole war. You know, he's out there, he is fighting the good fight, he's doing what he needs to do. And we get to the end. So we get to this last book up here, this Dragons of Spring Dawning, which actually I think is this one. We get to this last book, and within the last book, within the last section of the book, what's happening is the Dragon Queen is trying to break into the world. She's trying to get out of her prison, if you will, her abyss or whatever. And she's trying to get into the world. And of course, they're trying to stop it because she's an evil god. And Caramon he's there with someone, and he's beaten up, he's ragged, he hasn't seen his brother in a long time, and you know, he's expecting he's going to die, and he's being drugged through this temple, and out of nowhere comes his brother. And what's becomes shocking at this point is out of nowhere comes his brother, who walks up, and Raceland spoke with a very hissing voice, and he walks up and, you know, he tells him, "Brother, rest upon my shoulders." That may not be an exact quote, but it's essentially what it is. And Caramon, this big hulking beast of a man who's used to taking care of his frail brother, all of a sudden is now being supported by a brother who doesn't seem to be as frail and weak anymore. But more disconcerting at this point is Caramon looks over, and what does he see? He sees that Raceland, who, when he passed the test, wore the red robes, the neutral, if you will, robes. He notices that Raceland is now donned in the black robes. And this is a big thing for Caramon because black is evil. Black is synonymous with evil in that world. And he can't believe it. His brother, who he just was used to being this super emaciated figure, is now this strong enough to support his weight. And not only does he support his weight, but he uses what is now immensely more powerful magic that seemingly comes out of nowhere, and he vanquishes the people that are trying to kill him. And after he saves Caramon, he looks at him and he tells him, you know, he looks at him and he bids him adieu, and then he leaves him. So he saved him immediately, but Caramon's still, like, he's injured, he's hurt, he's maybe not directly dying, but he's certainly not, like, he's certainly on the way to dying. And Raceland kind of just puts him down. And then what's crazy is there's a scene where Tasselhoff, who is kind of, again, he's like the heart and soul of the party. I mean, a lot of people hate him because he can be annoying, but he is really like that innocent character. Well, Tasselhoff dies like a little bit earlier in what's going on in the story. He triggers a trap and dies. And Raceland raises him from the dead as if it ain't no big thing. And again, Caramon's head is spinning because his whole identity, his whole being is being the strong brother who protects Raceland. And here's Raceland raising people from the dead, saving him, casting spells, obliterating enemies. He doesn't know what to think. And then Raceland just looks at him and he hops on a dragon and he leaves him. And for the rest of that series, you don't really hear from Raceland anymore. And Caramon doesn't know what to do. I mean, they win the war. Spoiler alert. They win the war. But then comes the next stage in Caramon's life, which is probably a stage that I personally associate with or feel more than anything. And that's what happens post War of the Lance. So, and that's what this book series here kind of talks about. It talks about what happens after the War of the Lance ends. And when we visit Caramon at the beginning of the first book in this trilogy, we discover that he's married this barkeep, this little waitress that had been prevalent in the stories. And, you know, they moved back home and they got a house together and they bought this tavern. Except when you see Caramon the first time, it's shocking to the reader because he is this hulking, fat slob drunk. To put a modern reference point on it, it's kind of like, in my opinion, is a way more shocking reveal than when Fat Thor showed up in Endgame. Similar concept, but yeah, just along those same lines. Caramon shows up and he's disgusting. He's fat. He stinks. He's drunk all the time off of dwarven ale. His wife can't stand him anymore because he's a shell of his former self. And the book explores how he got there. And that kind of brings into the really important part of my lesson. And that is, after Raceland saves him and leaves, Caramon is forced to reevaluate who he is. His whole life, he has been a twin brother to Raceland, a protector of Raceland. But he never really got thank yous for it. He never really got an attaboy for it. It's just what he was, and he accepted that lot. He was a genuinely good person. He accepted that lot. So when the War of the Lance ends and Raceland disappears, Caramon kind of becomes a bit listless. But then he and Tika, they get married. That's his wife. And they have to rebuild because this war devastated this whole continent. So he finds purpose temporarily in using his strength to assist the carpenters in rebuilding Solus and rebuilding the towns. But once everything got rebuilt, the world didn't need Caramon anymore. The world didn't need a guy whose primary skill set was swinging a sword successfully. The war was over. They didn't need him once everything was rebuilt. And Caramon fell into a devastatingly deep depression where he washed his days away day in and day out with dwarven spirits, with just powerful, powerful alcohol to numb this emptiness that was inside of him. And when the readers meet back up with him at the beginning of Test Time and War, he's a shadow of his former self. And without giving away the storyline and stuff to Test Time and War, fat, drunk, stinky Caramon is forced to go with Tasselhoff to track down his brother, because it turns out his brother's up to some no good. And there's a lot of time travel in it, but in a good way. But anyway, there comes a point where they end up traveling back way, 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 way back in time before this event called the Cataclysm, which they talk about all the time in the first trilogy. The Cataclysm broke the whole continent, kind of shattered the world. And they go back in time to right before the Cataclysm. And when they first arrive, drunken, disorderly Caramon attacks a guard, not knowing any better, and gets his ass arrested and is thrown into what is essentially the gladiatorial pits. But as terrible as that was, it's nice because what did that do? That instilled a new purpose for Caramon. That gave him a new lease on life, because he threw himself into this training. They put him on a strict diet, no more booze, no more just gorging himself on food, and they made him bust his ass. And within a few short months, he was in better shape than he was before he became a fat, drunken slob. And he found a new lease on life, and it was great. Now, a lot of stuff happens in that book. Like a lot of stuff happens. And it all leads up to what I call the final goodbye. There's a moment at the end of that trilogy where Caramon and Raistlin see each other. And Caramon knows that he can't let Raistlin through this gate because bad things will happen. And what's kind of profound is when Raistlin gets there, he understands what's going on. And instead of fighting his brother, he gives his brother, for lack of a better term, the key to escape. And he stands back and sacrifices himself to save not only his brother, but the world, an act that doesn't make sense for Raistlin Majere. And this allows Caramon to have closure. And it allows him to leave behind that chapter in his life, which was so important, which had defined him so much, which was being this twin and protector of Raistlin. Now, obviously, I skipped over a lot of stuff there because I don't want to ruin the books. I highly encourage all of you to read them. They're by Margaret Weiss, Tracy Hickman. They're just amazing books. I've actually met Margaret Weiss. I met her at Gen Con. She's there a lot. It's a very large board game convention in Indianapolis. Incredibly nice lady. I bought her, what was it, her new series at the time, and got her to autograph them. Anyway, so now that we've talked about Caramon's life, what can we learn about it? So the first thing that comes to mind when I think of Caramon and I think of his story is I think of what happens to us when our central role, when the thing that we feel defines us changes. Because how we are defined and what we use to define us in a lot of ways defines our purpose. If we define ourselves as a mother and our kids leave home, what's our purpose at that point? When you spend 18 years nurturing and fostering a child and then they go off into the world, what are you then? If you are let's say you're an athlete, and all through high school you are, you've been a star athlete, and then your career ends, whether you go to collegiate or pros or whatever. You're an athlete, and then your career ends. What happens? What are you? I mean, I think that's the core of what happens with Caramon, is he is faced multiple times throughout his life with the realization that the role that he has used to define himself has changed. When he was young, his role was big brother to Raistlin and just general protector. So I would say protector. So brother to Raistlin, friend, protector. Then the test happens. And now his primary purpose changes and it becomes caretaker. And that's a lot different than protector, because he's still protector. But now Raistlin has magic. Now Raistlin can sort of defend himself, but his health is racked. And because his health is racked, he takes it out on Caramon. But then as shitty as that is for Caramon, it's a purpose. It's something he can latch onto. It's something he can use to move forward. And there's plenty of instances throughout the books where people threaten his brother. And even though his brother treats him like shit, Caramon steps up and makes it very clear. Anyone comes after his brother, they have to go through him. It's his purpose. It's what he does. But then Raistlin takes the black. Raistlin leaves him. And now everything that he has used to define himself, his purpose in life, is now gone. So it temporarily shifts to being a husband, and then it temporarily shifts to helping rebuild the town. But then when there's no more wars to fight, when there's no more buildings to build, when there's no more rebuilding that needs to be completed, all he's left with is his thoughts. And all he can think of is his brother left him. His twin is gone. He's not needed anymore. Nobody needs Caramon. Nobody cares that he can lift more than anyone or swing a sword or is a badass. Nobody fucking cares. They don't need him anymore. And so what happens is he self-detonates. He destroys. What's a good, I don't want to call it true, but a good word that's used a lot these days, he self-sabotages. And he becomes a glutton. And so many parts of that parallel things in my life, not only in the past, but also in the present. Right now, I'm not afraid to admit, I'm having a hell of a time with what I initially thought was overeating. And I don't really think it's so much overeating anymore. I've have issues where, and I'm sure it's tied to depression. I don't want to, I wouldn't say do anything, but like the only thing that becomes appealing to me is sitting in front of a TV, binge watching a show, and eating terrible food. And like, I'm a big dude. I mean, this is a video episode. You guys can see I'm a big dude. I've been a big dude my whole life. I've always been able to handle myself and move around as a big dude, and I've fluctuated some here and there. My heaviest was probably 315 pounds, which was right about the time I had stopped competing in strongman. And then I lost 100 pounds and shrunk down to 215. And I sat around there for a little while, and I'm probably sitting at like 260, I'm guessing right now. But to me, my problem is much like Caramon. I feel I have no purpose. So without diverting in 100 different directions, which it could clearly go to, I feel like I don't have a goal. I don't have a purpose. And that's a very difficult thing for people who are goal driven, for people who work off of lists. I'm a big list guy. Everything I do, from when I wake up in the morning, one of the first things I do when I brew my coffee is I write out my list for the day. And sometimes that list have lists referenced in them. So case in point, today I had a list that was, on my list for the day was to prep for this podcast, to complete my cleaning list, which was a separate list, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for people who are list oriented, for people who are goal driven, if you don't have a purpose, if there's not a finish line that you are moving towards, then you become listless. And for me, it's eating shitty fucking food and wasting my days doing nothing. And, I know it's cliche, but it's true. Garbage in, garbage out. You eat shitty food, you feel like shit, you act like shit, you think like shit. It's just the way it is. And I have been struggling personally with finding purpose. When I lost my 100 pounds in 11 months, I didn't lose it because I was like, I'm going to lose 100 pounds. That was never what it was. It started as, hey, there's this crazy thing called keto going around. Wonder if it works. Spoiler alert, turns out it works. And at first it was just like, I'm just going to see, because I was at the biggest I had ever been. I wasn't happy with myself. So I just did it, and I started seeing results, and it was kind of like that snowball effect. It's like, holy shit, it's working. And then like 2 months into it, I got my nod to take what's called my level 1 Muay Thai test, which, for lack of a better way to explain it, it's called a fighter test. It's supposed to be designed to say, if you can pass the test, you can fight. It's also, I guess, for the layman's, I guess you could kind of say it's probably the closest thing to a black belt that Muay Thai has, because it doesn't have belts. And before everyone, leaps ahead on that, for anyone who's in martial arts, you got to understand that the black belt is really just shows that you've mastered the basics. It's like getting a high school diploma. Like it's not easy to get. I mean, if it's a worthwhile pursuit, they're not handing those things out. For Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you're looking at about a decade to get your black belt, if you're lucky. But what I'm saying is a lot of people who aren't in martial arts, they hear the word black belt and they think, oh, you're some kung fu master expert. Not necessarily. It just means you've mastered the basics, and now you're kind of ready to start your postgraduate career. So that's what kind of the level 1 is. It kind of shows you've mastered the basics, that you could get into a ring, fight, and not get killed. And I never wanted to take my level 1. I didn't. Anyone who knows me knows that that's just was anything that was interesting to me. Excuse me. The last part of the test requires you to do 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, and run 3 miles. And 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, no big bang. Running 3 miles, I am built like a tank. I'm not built to run. So that was part that kind of always scared me. But my best friend is a buddy named Lance, who will one day be on the show, I swear. He kind of got the nod. He got the nod the same time I did. In fact, he got the nod before me, and they said, Lance, we want you to take your level 1. And Lance and I talked, and I said, hey guys, I want to go for my black belt eventually. Do you think it would behoove me, or what do you think about me going doing a level 1 with Lance. And they were like, go for it. And that became my purpose. That became my goal. And Lance and I, we busted our ass together for 3-4 months. I don't remember how long we trained for it. And I mean, we were doing workouts that were making our friends like just shake their heads like, oh my God, like, how are you doing it? And I mean, I guess I can't speak for Lance, though I'm pretty confident in saying this. We loved it. Those workouts are some of the best workouts I've ever done. The workouts were literally, I get to the end of it and I look what I did and I'm like, how did I not die? And it was this great purpose. And the time came and I went and I took my test and I passed it. And it sucked and it was hard, but it was such an amazing experience. And then it ended. And that was 2019. And what happened at the end of 2019? COVID hit. So there was talk after the level 1 that they were going to start taking a serious look at us and we were going to go for our black belts together, which was like a dream come true because I've always wanted to get my black belt. And also because getting a black belt with a brother in arms, someone that the bond, I mean, Lance and I were friends beforehand, but after training for our level 1 together, we became brothers, in my opinion, at that point. There was a bond that was formed. And going for black belts together just seemed like the appropriate next step. But then COVID came. And to reiterate what I said before, just like with Avatar, everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. Everything changed when COVID came. Gyms closed down. Priorities changed. You had people who were being reckless. You had people who weren't taking it serious. And things happened. And we're in July of 2021 now. And Lance and I have not resumed training. I mean, I still box and I go and I do stuff, but life happened and I lost that purpose. And I've been listless since. I mean, before I got back into martial arts, because I was into it as a kid. And again, I had purpose and I had goal. I was in judo and we did tournaments and we went and we did stuff. So I was training for a purpose. During the time period where I wasn't into martial arts, I'd gotten into strongman from a friend of mine who I've mentioned in prior episodes, my buddy JK. He had mentioned, he was like, you should try it. And I always thought, hey, I was a strong guy. In hindsight, I wasn't. I was strong for someone who had never lifted weights. But I started doing it and I liked it. I met up with a really cool group of people in the Johnstown area and I kind of dove into it and I started doing contests and it was fun because I was training for a purpose. But then I lost interest in it. Well, I wouldn't even say so much I lost interest in it. My body just did not want to keep doing it. My joints were like, hey man, you've had good knees your whole life. You've been doing strongman for 2 years now and your knees are starting to give you problems. So, and at that point I kind of rediscovered martial arts and that's always been like my first love. So I left the strongman sport and I went into martial arts and that gave me drive and that gave me purpose until the pandemic hit. And I feel like a lot of us have got to be experiencing that. I mean, I know I'm not alone. I know plenty of people I've talked to. But that brings me back to the question. And when I think about Caramon, it's why I feel a kinship to him is what happens when our purpose either leaves us or changes. I think the key for me personally, and I would like to, I don't generally like to paint with a broad brush, but I feel like painting with a broad brush here makes sense. I think the objective is to find a new goal. And I'm into 50,000 different side projects. I have a crafting business. I run Saber School. I'm been developing this podcast. And now this is a big thing of my life. I own a business, an adjusting business. I was trying to get my real estate license. I just got my out-of-state license for adjusting. So I'm into a lot of things, but I don't feel that I have a goal. I don't feel that I have something I'm running towards. I don't feel that I have a purpose. And it's a shitty feeling. I mean, let's just call it what it is. It's a shitty feeling to not have a purpose and to not have something that I'm working towards. And it makes you feel rudderless. It makes you feel without a direction. To put it into, a word picture, if you will. It's like I've stumbled and fallen into a hole, and I don't want to get out of it because I don't even know where I was walking to the first place. And it's tough. And I as I was doing my research for this episode, because it's been quite a number of years since I've read these books, obviously I relived Caramon's journey. And I think one of the ways his journey, he was able to move on after Test Time in War, was because he was able to say a proper goodbye to his brother, which was again that big thing. And how so for me, without getting all mopey on everybody, for me, I never really got to say a proper goodbye to my dad, and I never will because he's dead. Um, but I said the closest thing I could to him. And I'm in, I've been working with a therapist and stuff and finding ways to be okay with that. And the other big thing is when my marriage ended, which is something I haven't talked a whole lot about my marriage yet on the show, but I'm sure we will get into it. When my marriage ended, it ended abruptly, at least for me. Um, it ended abruptly. It ended on a very not good note, and there was no closure to it. There was no proper goodbye, if you will. And I often wonder if that doesn't play a role. And as you're listening to this, maybe you've never been married, maybe your parents are still alive or your parental figures are, but can you think of times where maybe when you're feeling this without a purpose, this rudderless thing, can you think of whether or not you had that opportunity to say a proper goodbye to whatever was going on in your life, or to whoever it was that was experiencing this? And if you haven't, how do you move past it? And those are really big questions to have. And I think part of it is being able to have like-minded people, to have that support staff, that support group, those people that you can go to when shit's feeling bad. There was one of my favorite television shows of all time is The West Wing. I arguably think it's the best television show that's ever been on the air. And there's an episode in there where they talk about there's like an analogy, and he talks about like, what do you do if you find a guy falling in a hole? And the whole motto of the story is a real friend jumps in the hole with you and helps you get out. So I think I guess what I'm trying to say is don't isolate yourself. Don't be alone. Don't be afraid to reach out to people. If you're having a hard time, we all have hard times. We all go through some shit. So if you don't have a support system, reach out to some. You want to talk, shoot me a message. I'll talk. If I don't know you, I'll get to know you. We're all on this planet together. It's a group effort. So yeah, I guess the other thing is, don't be afraid to take an inventory of your life. Don't be afraid to sit back and really kind of figure out where your priorities lie, what priorities you have that don't make sense anymore, what priorities you need to have. And don't be afraid to reorganize. Don't be afraid to take your inventory of what's going on in your life and cut out the fat. Be honest about yourself. Be honest about your shortcomings. Be honest about the things that you're rocking. Take a personal inventory and figure out what's working for you, and then edit it out. Add in the stuff that you need and remove the stuff that you don't. So that's just, so when I think of Caramon Majere, that's what I think about. And if you, again, to just plug it, if you haven't read these books, I strongly encourage you to read them because they are just so good. And if you're not into fantasy fiction, this is a great entryway. It's got everything. It's got humor, sadness, deaths, a lot of stuff. It's not bleak and as dark as like Sword of Truth or Game of Thrones or anything like that. It's, I guess you'd call it high fantasy, and it's good. It's really, really good. It's as far as fantasy classics are concerned, they're definitely in that category. So again, thank you guys for taking the time to listen to this. I really enjoyed this episode. I eventually am going to do each member of the Heroes of the Lance because there's so much to learn from each individual one. I'm not going to do them all at once. I'm going to sprinkle them in as we go about the episodes. As far as what is upcoming, there is an episode upcoming focused on my Starfinder group called the Enactioneers. That's going to be a multi-person episode. I believe we're recording it on August 1st, provided everyone's available. We do have someone coming in from out of town. So that'll be exciting. I think that's going to be a really fun episode for everyone. Lots of stories are going to be shared, lots of laughter. So that's in the works. I had a friend of mine reach out. We're going to put together an episode. He's a veteran with PTSD who is into tabletop gaming. And we just did an episode, the one right before this one. I had my friend Lou on from a local gaming society, and we're going to this friend who reached out to me, we're going to put something together and do an episode kind of focusing on specifically for veterans and or people who suffer from PTSD and how that type of thing can really help. And we'll discuss how it's helped him. And I think there'll be some really good insights. I'm not a veteran, so I like to really bring in people who can share that unique perspective. And I think that's something that can help a lot of people. So as always, I am your host, Tony B. It's been a pleasure. And I look forward to speaking with you all again in the future. Take care, everybody.